Hello, and welcome back to Something to Noodle On. I'm your host, Mac, an average 30-something exploring the complex questions that keep us awake at night. Before we get started, sorry for the late episode, but hey, at least we got one out this week. If you have been enjoying our content, please give this podcast 5 stars or a thumbs up or whatever appeases the pod gods on the listening platform of your choice. Anyway, lately, I've been thinking about how when we're sitting around with people our age, at some point in the conversation, someone usually says, "Kids these days have it so easy." And then someone else chimes in about how we used to drink from the hose or how we didn't have smartphones with GPS glued to our hands. And shortly after, we're all smiling and sharing stories from our childhoods. And I get it. There is something comforting about remembering the struggle of adolescence and the accomplishment we felt after working hard and achieving our goals. Even if it was something as silly as riding our bikes all over town just to find that one friend and hang out. But I wonder if we're missing something when we compare our childhood to what kids are navigating now. Because yes, technology has made life more convenient in so many ways. We can look up answers instantly and connect with people across the globe. We can order dinner without speaking to another human being if we don't want to. But is everything easier just because it's more convenient? Or are we remembering our own adolescence through a lens that softens the hard parts because we survived them? Do kids actually have it easier these days? Let's talk about it on Something to Noodle On. We happen to be in a pretty unique position historically. We grew up at a time when the internet existed, but it didn't dominate our lives the way it does now. It was something we accessed, not something we lived inside of. If we think back, getting online was a whole damn event. We struggled through the dial-up noise and yelled at our siblings to hang up the phone to save our connection. Even basic pages of text sometimes took forever to load. And if your MySpace page had games on it, forget about it if it wasn't already cached. But when we logged off, we were actually offline. No one could reach us unless they physically came to our door or called the house. That boundary mattered, even if we didn't fully appreciate it at the time. When we left school for the day, we mostly left the social dynamics behind. If someone was irritated with us on Friday afternoon, there was a good chance we wouldn't hear about it again until Monday morning. There was space. There was breathing room. There was time for things to just cool down. Now, the internet is not a place we go. It's an environment we exist in. Our social lives sit in our pockets. Our reputations are shaped in comment sections, and our friendships unfold in group chats that never really sleep. We are probably the last generation that knows what it feels like to grow up without being constantly reachable, constantly visible, and constantly recorded. And I think that is worth acknowledging before we jump into any conclusions about who has it harder or easier. The social landscape of today feels very different from the past. For teenagers, past and present, adolescence has always been about figuring out where we fit and how others see us and how we see ourselves. Even young adult novels written centuries ago still resonate because the need to find our place in the world hasn't changed. What has changed is the structure of the social world young people are navigating. Even if we are hesitant to say kids have it harder, I think most of us can agree that the terrain of adolescence has shifted in some significant ways. When we were growing up, social hierarchies absolutely existed. We knew who the popular kids were, who the quiet kids were, and where we generally fell on that spectrum. And think of any teen movie from when we were growing up. How much they relied on the jock, cheerleader, nerd, or whatever stereotype so we could instantly understand who those characters were without a ton of exposition. Social status seemed to define our entire lives, but those dynamics were contained within physical spaces. They lived in classrooms and cafeterias and football games. Now, the average teenager's social life has an extra layer attached to it. Every social interaction is now subject to metrics. Instead of just wondering whether we fit in, there are visible numbers suggesting how we are being received. How many followers do we have? How many likes did that post get? And who did or didn't view our story? Imagine our 13 or 14-year-old self when your sense of identity was already fragile and under construction. Those numbers would feel like evaluations rather than neutral data. And teenagers these days are in the thick of it. If they post something and it doesn't get the response they hoped for, it's easy to internalize that as a commentary on themselves rather than on an algorithm or timing or randomness. And when they see photos of friends hanging out at a party without them, that exclusion is not just suspected, it's documented. If we ever felt left out growing up, we didn't usually have visual confirmation of it in real time. And we weren't carrying a running tally of our perceived worth in our pockets all day long. That kind of constant awareness of where you stand socially can subtly shape how we perceive our own worth. Now, think of a time when you did something completely embarrassing as a teenager. We all said awkward things, tripped in the hallways, or wore outfits we later regretted. But most of those moments live only in the memory of a few people who were there when it happened. When we retell the story later, it's filtered through human recollection. So some details are lost or forgotten. Over time, the emotional intensity softens, and eventually it becomes something we can laugh about. Now, almost everyone carries a camera in their pocket at all times, ready to record anything within seconds. So embarrassing moments can be recorded and replayed exactly as they happened. And when something exists as a video file rather than as a story, it carries a different weight. It can be paused, it can be zoomed in on, it can be shared beyond the original audience. That doesn't mean every awkward moment becomes viral, but knowing the possibility that any action we decide to take can be captured and shared instantly changes how freely we move through our environment. Could you imagine having to navigate adolescence, constantly worrying that any mistake could be filmed and uploaded to the internet? If adolescence is supposed to be a time when we experiment socially and occasionally fall flat, the awareness that falling flat might be preserved can make experimentation feel riskier. It can encourage caution at a stage of life that historically has required trial and error. Documenting life has become so normal that sometimes we forget the weight of it. There is a difference between being embarrassed in front of 30 classmates and being embarrassed in front of an unknowable audience online. We talk a lot about how self-conscious we were as teenagers. Now, imagine layering a very real possibility that our worst moment might live on beyond the original room where it happened. For me, I think about a small moment that at the time was mortifying, and my friends didn't understand why. I don't even think to this day I told them why. But flashback to 6th grade. I was wearing a black hoodie with light blue athletic pants, complete with a navy blue racing stripe down the sides, which was peak early 2000s. My friends Sarah and Alex were giggling when I stood up to sharpen my pencil. I asked them what was so funny, and they wouldn't tell me. They giggled and just said, "Turn around." Terrified, I thought maybe my period had leaked through my light-colored pants. I refused. I asked why. Tell me what was so funny. They said if I stood up, they would show me. I started panicking. The boy I liked sat at the table behind us, and I didn't want to stand up in fear that they would see. Sarah and Alex didn't understand why I didn't want to stand up, and I, becoming overwhelmed by the situation, started tearing up. Now, Sarah was annoyed that I was becoming upset and said, "Fine, you have a string from your hoodie hanging on your butt." And I said, "That's it? That's what was so funny?" And they were like, "Yeah. If you just would have stood up, we would have showed you." Now, I'm even more embarrassed for what they saw as overreacting and drawing attention to myself from others when I started tearing up in front of everyone. If that was in today's era, I fear it could have been recorded or a picture taken of me crying in class. For that, I'm grateful it was in 2002. Bullying is something many of us faced growing up. Maybe it seems more prevalent now, but it's certainly not a new concept. These days, it just looks different from what we experienced. But there used to be physical boundaries to it. When we went home, there was usually some distance from the social dynamics of the day. Even if something was unresolved, there was space between interactions. If someone left a mean message on the answering machine, that message stayed on that machine until we deleted it. It didn't multiply for everyone to see. Now, conflict can follow us everywhere, continuing without interruption. A disagreement at school can turn into a flurry of messages in a group chat or spill into comments on social media posts. It can involve people who weren't even present for the original situation. And because so much communication happens through digital communication like texts and DMs, where facial expressions and body language are stripped away, misunderstandings snowball quickly. And when we don't have to look someone in the eye, it becomes disturbingly simple to say things we would never dare to say face to face. It's just the current reality that being anonymous lowers inhibitions. When we are shielded by a screen name, empathy can thin out, and mean things get even meaner when the person saying them doesn't fear repercussions. Who's going to figure out it was them anyway? For kids today, the onslaught never stops to rest. Not even at the end of the day when they're tucked into bed. We didn't have to navigate being socially attacked while we're lying in bed at night. Our phones lighting up beside us every few moments, constantly carrying the weight of a conflict that refuses to pause. Even if they turn off their phones, those messages are waiting for them as soon as they power their devices back on. And with that kind of constant accessibility, it's no wonder that bullying can feel inescapable. As heavy as constant social visibility can feel, there is another layer that might be even more significant, and that is permanence. One of the quiet gifts of growing up when we did was the ability to outgrow who we were without a permanent record trailing behind us, aside from yearly class photos and our transcripts at least. In the same way constant visibility reshapes social life, permanence reshapes identity development. If there's one thing that feels genuinely different about growing up now, it's the sense that moments don't disappear the way they used to. When we were teenagers, our identities were constantly shifting. One year we were obsessed with Jinko jeans, and the next year we rolled our eyes at the version of ourselves that was way too fond of excess denim. We tried on personalities, we borrowed opinions, we contradicted ourselves freely. And most of that experimentation evaporated. It lived in yearbooks and photo albums and maybe a few cringy journal entries stuffed in a drawer somewhere. But unless someone was intentionally keeping a record, the evidence of who we were at 14 didn't follow us in any systematic way. Now, digital footprints start early. Many kids have an online presence before they can even form long-term memories. Photos are shared, stories are posted, moments are documented. By the time someone is in high school, there may already be years of content attached to their name. Not necessarily because teenagers are trying to archive their lives, but because documentation is baked into the structure of their world. You can even boil it down to parents posting baby pics, the funny toddler tantrum videos, and the sports highlights from Little League. And I think that changes the internal experience of growing up. Let's break that down a little bit more. When you know that something might be searchable later, you think differently about saying it in the first place. Even as adults, we do this. We hesitate before posting something political. We wonder how a joke might be interpreted out of context. We consider future employers. Now, imagine being 14 and trying to figure out who you are while also subconsciously calculating how your words might land 5 years from now. That's a lot of cognitive load. We used to be able to be wrong quietly. We could express an opinion that was half-formed, get corrected by a friend, feel embarrassed, adjust, and move on. The correction happened in a contained environment. Now, expressing a half-formed opinion online can invite correction at scale. Sometimes it results in thoughtful correction, but other times, and probably most times to be honest, it results in harsh criticism. All too often, strangers like to weigh in without context, especially when they're running unfiltered on social media. And that can train someone, especially someone young, to either over-curate themselves into the image of perfection or to just withdraw entirely, losing their authentic self in the process. But if a pivotal part of growing up is trying ideas on and sometimes discarding them, and the trying on process feels risky, for reasons we've mentioned before, I think the logical conclusion is that young people will be less likely to experiment and will miss out on important self-discoveries. We talk a lot about teenagers oversharing. I know I definitely said some awkward, silent thoughts aloud as a teen. But these days, we also see teenagers carefully constructing versions of themselves that feel safe. And I can't help but wonder whether the awareness of permanence is part of that. Now let's add relationships and intimacy into the mix, because this is another place where permanence can shape the emotional landscape. Teenagers have always experimented with intimacy. They've always tested boundaries, and they've always misplaced trust. That's just part of being human. But the tools available to teenagers now can amplify the consequences of that misplaced trust. The potential scale of harm when trust is broken is higher now than ever before. And that's before even considering the individuals out there who exploit young people. A private conversation or image can be saved, shared, reposted, and stored in places that are difficult to track down. Even when something is removed, the knowledge that it once circulated can linger. Once something is out there, it can spread in ways that are difficult to contain. Even if it's taken down, there's the lingering question of who saved it, who saw it, and who might still have it. The knowledge alone can create a lasting sense of vulnerability. And I think what makes this particularly heavy is that teenage brains are still developing impulse control and long-term foresight. The ability to fully calculate digital consequences is not always there yet. So we have a developmental stage that has always involved impulsivity paired with technology that preserves impulsive decisions in durable formats. That's a complicated pairing. This doesn't mean teenagers are incapable of responsibility. It just means the margin for error is thinner. And when that happens, the emotional stakes feel higher. Trust has always been fragile, but now the consequences of misplaced trust can feel enormous. We didn't have to think about digital permanence in quite the same way when navigating our early romantic experiences. And I'd like to think that as an adult, I have a better handle on situations surrounding intimacy and sensitive personal content than I did when I was a teenager. But when I really sit down and think about it, it's still pretty scary, even as an adult. Just the fact that revenge porn exists on websites is horrifying. This reminds me of the episode of Euphoria where Kat was being intimate with someone at a party. Unbeknownst to her, the guy had set up a phone and recorded the whole thing, which he later shared with his friends. Can you even imagine if your first time was recorded and then spread around the school or shared with other people? That's traumatizing to think about, and I'm grateful that wasn't even close to our reality growing up. I think the experience I remember the most about being a teenager is just how difficult it is to sift through all the information out there. Even back then, there was so many outside forces influencing us, pushing and pulling us in the directions they wanted us to go, filling our heads with all sorts of ideas, but not equipping us with the ability to understand exactly what we were committing to or to predict where they'd lead us in the future. And with the internet exposing today's teens to hundreds, if not thousands, of different schools of thought, both good and bad, It's so easy for them to be led in the wrong direction. And now we're living in a time where accountability conversations are more visible and, in many ways, more necessary. Everything we say online, every thought we share, every idea we type is subject to scrutiny by very large groups of our peers. And teens are not excluded from this. As we've been saying, whatever you do or say, the internet remembers. Teenagers are in a stage of rapid cognitive and moral development. They are absorbing new information constantly and making decisions about who they are and how they want the world to see them. They're attempting to find their place in the world and surround themselves with others who share their beliefs and values. Their worldviews are forming and reforming in real time as they learn, process, apply, and evaluate outcomes. So when something someone said at 13 resurfaces at 30, we're confronted with a question. Is that statement a reflection of who they are now or who they were in the middle of learning? When there's a permanent record, it can be tempting to freeze someone in their worst moment. The evidence is right there. It feels concrete, but growth is not always documented as clearly as mistakes are. We can screenshot a harmful comment, but it's harder to screenshot quiet change and personal transformation. How do we hold people accountable in a way that acknowledges harm while still allowing room for development, especially in a world where nothing really disappears? Something I'd like to touch on is, are we even remembering our past accurately? After all this discussion, I think it would be easy to conclude that kids today unquestionably have it harder. But I want to be careful here because nostalgia is powerful and it likes to edit the past to give it a rosy tinted gloss. And because memory is not a perfect archive, when we think about our childhood or teenage years, we don't usually replay a full unfiltered timeline. We replay the highlights of our proudest moments and recall the funny stories. We reminisce on the parts that make us feel happy, relaxed, or resilient. And we tend to remember the feeling of freedom more than the feeling of isolation. The unchaperoned afternoons at the park and the sleepless sleepovers and the endless pizza parties are often more vivid than the nights we felt misunderstood and didn't have the right language to explain why. We acknowledge the struggles, the trials, and the tragedies of youth, but don't like to linger on them. So let's zoom out and look at this from a different perspective. When I think about growing up, I immediately picture freedom, riding bikes without checking in every hour, knocking on a friend's door and hoping they were home, being unreachable unless someone physically tracked you down. There was a looseness to it. But if I noodle on it longer, I also remember something else. I remember being in middle school and having emotions I didn't really have the words to describe. When I think back on it now, I think the words are lonely or sadness. I think I was always kind of struggling with depression, but not really understanding what it was and if others felt the same way. Back then, we didn't talk openly about how we were feeling. Those were private emotions. But knowing if my peers felt the same way would have been game-changing. Now, there's resources on the internet to read information on, or forums like Reddit to chat with others about experiences you might be going through. With the help of the internet, we don't feel so alone. If you were the only kid in your friend group who felt different in some way, that difference could feel magnified by isolation. There was no online community to quietly scroll through at midnight and think, oh, it's not just me. If you had a niche interest, you might have been the only one in your school who cared about it. And maybe you learned to downplay it because it didn't translate socially. So yes, we had physical freedom, but sometimes that freedom also meant navigating internal struggles without much reinforcement that they were normal. Now, a teenager can open an app and find thousands of people who share their interest, their identity, or their specific brand of awkwardness. That doesn't mean their experience is easy. Online spaces can be brutal too, but the possibility of connection is broader. And I have to be honest enough to admit that there are moments in my own adolescence where I would have benefited from that. Something else we often overlook is how the language around mental health has changed. When I was a teenager, I felt stress. I felt the weight of comparison against my peers. I felt pressure from all directions, but I didn't necessarily have language for what I was experiencing. If I felt constantly on edge, I might have just called myself dramatic. If I felt socially drained, I might have assumed I was bad at friendships. Mental health conversations were not a mainstream. Therapy was not something people talked about casually. Boundaries were not a common concept in teenage vocabulary. Now, teenagers use words like anxiety, overstimulated, burnout, and toxic in everyday conversation. Sometimes adults roll their eyes at that. We say they're overlabeling everything, and maybe sometimes they are, but there's also something powerful about having language. When you can name a feeling, it becomes less mysterious. And being able to Google a feeling and find articles, videos, and conversations about it can reduce the sense that you're somehow broken or flawed. I know so many of us internalized our struggles because we didn't have frameworks to communicate them. So while today's teens might experience amplified comparison, they also have amplified conversations about coping. They're seeing therapy normalized. They're hearing influencers talk about panic attacks and medication and setting boundaries with friends. That doesn't erase the pressure of social media, but it does give them tools we didn't necessarily have. I don't want to dismiss that just because it looks different from what we grew up with. Every generation tends to believe the next one has it easier, and every generation forgets parts of what made their own youth complicated. For some reason, we tend to treat hardship like it's a competition. We'll say things like, well, we had to memorize phone numbers, or we didn't have YouTube tutorials, as if inconvenience automatically equals character building. But inconvenience and emotional strain are not interchangeable. Yes, we had to figure things out without instant answers. Finding information on Wikipedia is 1,000 times easier than searching an alphabetized set of Encyclopedia Britannica for a significant date. But we also didn't have the pressure of curating an online identity. They don't have to use a paper map, but they do have to think about whether a post will be screen recorded. The shape of difficulty has shifted, and when we frame it as a competition, we risk oversimplifying both experiences. We flatten our own adolescence into a story of toughness and flatten theirs into a story of softness. But if we're honest, our teenage years were not simple either. We cried over friendships. We obsessed over how we looked. We felt excluded. We felt misunderstood. We made decisions that now make us cringe. The context was different, but those feelings were felt just as intensely. So maybe instead of asking who had it worse, we could ask, what are the specific pressures shaping them right now? That question invites curiosity instead of comparison. And curiosity feels more productive. Instead of comparing pain across generations, maybe we could focus on understanding the unique pressures of this moment. And maybe even realize we're not so different after all. We have all the things we can learn from each other, no matter what generation we grew up in. And there's one more angle here I want to touch on. When we talk about how resilient we were, we're speaking as adults who made it through adolescence. We're not speaking as our 14-year-old selves. If you had asked me at 14 whether things felt easy, I would have said, fuck no. I would have told you my problems were enormous, my stresses were overwhelming, and the stakes were high for everything. Time compresses that intensity and distance softens it. We have the privilege now of knowing how it all turned out. We know which friendships lasted and which were seasonal. We know which embarrassments were temporary and what our friends really remembered us for. Teenagers don't have that perspective yet. Their current stressors feel permanent because they're still in the middle of them. And that's true, whether the stressor is a group chat conflict or a cafeteria table dynamic in 1998. Maybe part of the reason we think kids have it easier is because we're comparing their present stress to our past stress. And if that's true, then maybe the conversation isn't really about whether kids have it easier at all. Maybe it's simply about sharing perspective. Every generation grows up inside the only world it has ever known. We didn't sit around in middle school thinking, wow, I'm so glad I don't have social media. We were just living our lives, just like teenagers today are. And maybe why we feel so strongly about the past is because we're watching a generation grow up in real time inside tools that didn't exist when we were forming our identities. It's unfamiliar, and unfamiliar can feel threatening or excessive or softer or harder, depending on how you decide to look at it. But if we look at the larger picture, adolescence has always been a season of intensity. It has always been awkward and dramatic and beautiful and fragile. The details change. The stakes feel different. The tools evolve. But the core experience of trying to figure out who you are while desperately wanting to belong, that part hasn't gone anywhere. The truth is, we're not that far removed from being teenagers ourselves. We remember what it felt like to care deeply about things that adults brushed off. We remember wanting someone to take our struggles seriously instead of minimizing them. So instead of debating over who had it worse, maybe we should remember what it felt like to be in the middle of it and choose empathy over comparison. Many of us probably have teenagers in our lives, like our own kids or students or nieces or nephews. They certainly don't want to hear it when we start a sentence with, back in my day. So instead, maybe we should try a different approach to the conversation. How can we use our knowledge and experience to offer guidance in a world where the internet never really sleeps? We just spent 30 minutes talking about how we didn't have these particular challenges at their age, but we did still live through them. As comedian Eliza Schlesinger likes to put it, we walked on Instagram so they could run on TikTok. We still understand what it's like to base our worth on social media interactions, to know that once a picture is out there, it's out there forever, and to feel the ever-present danger of trusting the wrong person with intimate details. Maybe we can be a part of the solution instead of adding to the commentary. As always, I hope we gave you something to noodle on this week. For me, it's understanding that kids these days are learning and growing through their mistakes live in real time for the world to see, while we quietly got to become a better person at our own pace. I certainly would not want my growing pains to be broadcasted to the world, but that's exactly what they're going through right now. So let me ask you this. Next time you have a remark about the youth having it easier than we did and calling them snowflakes, ask yourself, do they truly have it easier, or are they processing a mental load that internally we can't even fathom? Let's talk about it online at A Pod to Noodle On or on Discord. Until next time, bye!